Okay, Claire. I would like to welcome everybody here to our October Hot Topics, where our District Attorney for Pender and Hanover counties, Mr. Ben David, will present on fighting crime by keeping kids in school. Our League of Women Voters is a non-partisan organization. However, we do seek to educate ourselves and others on issues and conduct research or plan advocacy activities that align with state and national league positions. This Hot Topics presentation, in fact, grew out of some research that our Education Action Team conducted a while ago on the benefits of early childhood education with local leaders and legislators. One of them was Mr. David's office. And Mr. David got back to us after he received our report and offered to present to our group. Then COVID kind of got in the way, but here we are. And Mr. David's office promotes the importance of early childhood education and preventing future involvement with the criminal justice system. If you're interested in learning more about the issues we support or reading some of our reports and position statements, please go to our website. I've put it on the chat box. If you're not already a member, consider joining us. Just some Zoom housekeeping. We've got everybody on mute during the presentation. And while he presents, Mr. David is not going to take questions, but feel free to put any questions you would like to ask in the chat box, and then we'll do a question and answer directly after his presentation. So Beth, would you like to introduce Mr. David?
Yes, thank you, Ann. It's my pleasure to introduce District Attorney Ben David. Mr. Ben David received his BA degree from the University of Florida and his JD degree from Wake Forest University School of Law. He was employed for 3 years in the trademark litigation section at Peachtree, Stockton. 5 years after joining the 5th District, which is New Hanover and Pender counties, he was elected as District Attorney and is currently in his 4th term. Ben's professional organizations include the National District Attorneys Association, the North Carolina District Attorneys Association, and the North Carolina State Bar. He's a member of the Wilmington Downtown Rotary and a founding member of the Blue Ribbon Commission on the Prevention of Youth Violence in Wilmington. As District Attorney, he served on the Chief Justice's Commission on Professionalism, the Governor's Gang Task Force, and is a founding member of Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration. He's a past president of the North Carolina Conference of District Attorneys. Ben is also a certified handler for Potter, a wonderful dog used in the courthouse to assist victims of crime. Mr. David is the author of Crime and Community in the Cape Fear and teaches its corresponding course as an adjunct professor at UNCW. I took this course through OLLI last year and highly recommend it to anyone interested in how the local criminal justice system works and the role of all citizens in crime prevention. As Ann mentioned, we sent Mr. David a copy of our report on preschool education, and he responded by offering to speak to us on the importance of education to preventing crime. And we're delighted he's able to join us today. Welcome, Ben.
Well, thank you so much for this kind invitation. And I want to begin by thanking the League of Women Voters for all of your wonderful advocacy through the years. The indispensable function that you serve cannot be overstated. I have been to many of the debates that you have hosted through the years. I've been in some of them. And I think it's so important now more than ever for people to be informed about their community and the important issues that face all of us, particularly around this time of the year. Full disclosure, I am not in an election right now. I run every 4 years and I'm in the middle of my 4th term. I do plan on seeking a 5th term. And so that will be up in 2022. But what I want to talk to you about today is our children. And you talk about a hot topic. I actually have to leave here by about 2:50, and that was not scheduled originally, but that was before we had not 1, not 2, but 4 children shot over this weekend since Thursday. And the chief of police and I are getting together at 3 o'clock at the WPD to address the media about what we can do. So I apologize if I'm having to cut this even a little short today, but I hope you understand why. You can't schedule an emergency, and we're having one right now. I'd like to talk to you about our children, though, because I think if you're demographically like I think you are, it must seem very foreign to you to hear about some of the issues that we could talk about as it relates to gang violence and drug overdoses. We had a 20-year-old die this weekend of a drug overdose. We have about one a week in my district dying from heroin and fentanyl. It must seem like reading about a third world country sometimes when you hear about the conditions that some of our children are living in right here in this region. And so let's talk a little bit about where we are in America right now. In America, we have about 2.5 million people in prison. We are 5% of the world's population and 25% of the Earth's prisoners. Let me repeat that. America is 5% of the Earth's population, and we're 25% of the world's prisoners. If the Department of Corrections was its own state, we'd be the 37th most populous one when we talk about who's in jail and prison in America. There has been a great growth in mass incarceration, largely because of this war on drugs that's a failed war, and I think we all know that. We have seen protests throughout this summer in particular after the murder of George Floyd, and I think many people are now asking questions about what our larger role is in the criminal justice system, particularly as it relates to communities of color and people living in poverty. And so let's talk about why I'm focusing on education, not just now, but in the 16 years I've been the elected district attorney. I became the district attorney 2 days after my first child was born. And she turned 16 last month. And I've always looked at my job through the lens of being a father. I'm blessed with 3 children now, and Stephanie and I have our hands full when we get home. When you think about children, I think most people say the first thing we need to do is make sure they're staying in school. Back to my job, when you look at who's in jail and prison, 2 out of 3 people who are in prison dropped out of high school. 2 out of 3. So one thing that we've tried to do in the places of highest crime, highest poverty, and they overlay with each other almost exactly, is we've really focused on educational strategies. We've reopened DC Virgo, for instance, when it was closed. That was an inner city middle school that was failing about 10 years ago. And we reopened that as a school of excellence. And it's now a charter school with UNCW. It's actually called a laboratory school, excuse me. But speaking of great charter schools, GLOW is a wonderful school that's really focusing on our children. And it's a single sex, it's the first female charter school in our state. Here's why Judy Gerard, the founder of that school, originally approached me to go to New York City with her. She said, you know, Ben, I know you've talked a lot about violence on the street. I just came from a place where the Tisch Foundation and Tisch, for the last 20 years, they've been running an all-female charter school where starting in the 6th grade, we're going to keep them in school through their senior year, and then they're going to go to college. Maybe you need to do that in your district. I went up to New York with her. This was about 6-7 years ago now, and immediately recognized that we needed something like that for Wilmington. Because what I had just seen through my work with the Blue Ribbon Commission on the Prevention of Youth Violence, going into, again, the areas of highest poverty and highest crime, was that just for the 250 kids who were going into that school district, they were coming from 87 homes where there was only 4 fathers living under roof of those 87 homes, raising 250 kids. And we know that a lot of them have every challenge you can imagine. And when they don't find structure at home, they find it in each other, and that's called a gang. And to fight gang violence, we need to give them structure. And that, of course, should start with a structured school day. And while it's absolutely true that more young men are committing crimes than more young women, it's also true that when you train a young woman, when you give her an education, you're not only training that individual, you're teaching the next generation, right? Because nothing drives education better than maternal literacy. And so Judy, I think, had a real genius about her to say, we need to bring to Wilmington what worked in New York City. And just let me give you a couple of statistics about the Glow Academy, which it's now got a 10th grade class. So it's been up and running for 4 years of having these girls. In a traditional school, normal public school, from first generation college bound kids, we know that only 60% will actually graduate from high school from the typical youth enrichment zone family. 60%. Well, what about the other 40%? Well, before you answer that question, let's keep going. Of that 60% who graduates high school, only 8 of those 100 girls were actually now going to college. Now, we can talk about teen pregnancy. We can talk about poverty. We know that the best way to never be in poverty is to graduate high school, get a job, and get married. You do those 3 things before you have a baby of your own, and you have a 98% chance of never living in poverty. We know that statistically. So if we're focusing on our young women with those 3 things, and Judy's model does, here's how the game changes after 20 years of looking at what are now 16 schools across the country before they came here to Wilmington. We know that not 60%, but 93% actually graduate from high school under that Glow model, where you got a girl told in the 6th grade, you will go to college, and you have a guidance counselor pushing you along starting in the 6th grade. And of those 93, every single one of them who graduated from high school is going to college. Not 8, but 93. And they're 4 times more successful when they get there versus peers from that same demographic. We know that over a 20-year study. So what we've done here in Wilmington is just in our youth enrichment zone, again, where we're talking about is the north side of Wilmington, where a lot of these shootings I've just mentioned are coming from. We reduced violent crime by 28% over a 3-year period by merely increasing graduation rates by 25%. So why am I talking to you about school today? Because it's really the best crime prevention that we can talk about when we're mentioning that about our kids. Now, there's something else we need to confront, and that is that 21 years ago, Columbine happened. You'll remember that awful school shooting right outside of Denver in Littleton, Colorado, where 2 young men opened fire and killed a dozen classmates and a teacher. I actually became a prosecutor in this office the day after that incident. And so I have prosecuted in a post-Columbine world. And we have had many school shootings since then, haven't we? Including even elementaries now. So what's been our response to all of that? Our response has been, let's put more officers with guns in schools to keep our kids safe, right? That is a natural reaction. People say we need a good guy with a gun. But here's the unintended consequence. When you suddenly start filling up schools with school resource officers, police officers, when that incident at school was happening, instead of it merely going to the principal's office, it was now coming to the courthouse, because a lot of times what was handled as a discipline issue when you were growing up and when I was growing up was now being criminally charged. If you've heard that term, the school to prison pipeline, what they're referring to is in the last 20 years, we've had crime going like this among our children coming out of schools. And they've been coming to the courthouse. And you haven't been hearing about that because juvenile petitions are secret. They're not something we have press conferences about. They're not something that we have open courts and hearings on that the public can walk into. And so the unintended consequence around America, and certainly around North Carolina, is that we started criminalizing behavior that, for the vast majority of it, was just kids acting out. And so what have we done in this district to say, let's not have a school to prison pipeline where over 55% of all juvenile petitions are coming out of principals' offices. Let's actually start focusing on disciplining kids and really saving criminal justice for the things that really, really need it, like these shooting cases we just mentioned, but not the disruptive stuff in the hallway, not even two boys fighting over a girl necessarily. That's probably going to be something that they can hug it out and be fine, and we're better off handling it as a discipline issue. And so Chief Judge Jay Corpening and I, he runs the juvenile crime division in addition to overseeing the other 9 district court judges. A few years ago, we got together with the school administration, with a bunch of principals, and said, you know, you can't discipline a kid 2 months from now. If they make a mistake, you got to discipline them now. And if what you're doing is serving a juvenile petition saying you're suspended, what do you think is going to happen? They're going to be out on the street. They're not going to have that structure, and they're not going to appreciate the consequences of their action when we get to their case 60 days from now. We need to deal with that right here at the schoolhouse when it happens, and only in the extreme case should we be making an arrest. We started what's called a juvenile justice partnership with the schools. It's called the School Justice Partnership. And what we've done in just 2 short years is we've reduced juvenile filings in my district by 50%. And schools are safer. And so are the streets, because there's fewer kids that are getting long-term suspended. Now, we're in a real difficult time for our community, just like our country, because of COVID. A lot of kids aren't in schools, and we're seeing what's going on right now. So we really need to try and focus our attention back to, I believe, getting them safely to school. And I know that that's a more complicated public health situation than I can address just from my chair as district attorney. But what I will say is that working together with school administrators and with school resource officers, we've really tried to nip a lot of this in the bud where it exists. Second thing I wanted to mention as it relates to not just the pipeline in, but the collateral consequences when a kid is convicted. North Carolina was the last of the 50 states to say that you're an adult at age 18. Up until this time last year, in fact, December 1st last year is when we raised the juvenile age, kids were considered to be as old as anyone listening right now when they were 16. That's when you're allowed to consent to sexual activity. You're allowed to go get a job and pay taxes. You are allowed to drop out of school. And anything you do, you're considered adult for criminal purposes. So when you get that driver's license, because that's the deadliest weapon in any district every year, you are considered an adult for all criminal purposes. And so that means if you get arrested for shoplifting, or you get a DWI, or you break into a car, that moment that you're 16 years old, that doesn't just get hidden from people's view like juvenile court, and it doesn't get expunged or removed from your record one day. That stays with you for life. Now, who here listening thinks they had the same level of maturity when they were 16 that they do now? So here's what happened through time. Kids that did the same stuff in South Carolina and Virginia, to say nothing of California and Mississippi and Florida, when they were 16 and 17 and they were doing these things, they were getting that second chance when they were 18, and they were still able to go to the military. They were still able to go off to college. They were still able to apply for a job and not have a criminal record. Our kids weren't. Even one nonviolent felony on someone's record, listen to this closely, even one nonviolent felony on someone's adult record reduces their future earning potential by 40% over their lifetime. So my job as district attorney, listen, I hope you don't think I'm here to say we're going light on crime. I save my wrath for child molesters, for people who are doing violent crimes like rape, murder, and armed robbery. I have unapologetically been a murder prosecutor for 2 decades now, and I try some of the worst people and some of the worst cases that we could talk about, including, unfortunately, sometimes involving our very young children. I've bound over children as young as 14 and 15 years old to adult court when they've done a murder, and we're not talking about shielding those kinds of cases from view. But the stuff that we were talking about, 90% of all juvenile offenses were nonviolent. 90% of these 16 and 17-year-olds were coming into our system for nonviolent offenses. And so Judge Corpening and I were actually the only two people from the entire justice system in our state who went before the North Carolina legislature 3 years ago now and said, we're asking you to raise the juvenile age from 16 to 18. And in a very nonpartisan, bipartisan way, they listened. And they've raised the juvenile age to 18 starting this time last year. That's a wonderful development, because now these kids are going to have that second chance. They're going to still go to Carolina, just like the same kid who got it was going in South Carolina or to the UVA. They're still able to do that. So that was the right thing by our kids. We're trying to keep them in school with that school justice partnership. We've tried to keep some things off kids' records by sending them to teen court. And if any of you have children or grandchildren in our schools, you hopefully know what we're talking about, where say a kid steals a lawnmower out of a neighbor's shed. In order to get into teen court instead of our juvenile court, they have to plead guilty and say, I did that and I'm sorry. So now the hearing is not about guilt or innocence, but on the appropriate sentencing disposition. But instead of standing before Jay Corpening, where Ben David is the prosecutor, they're actually in teen court where every participant there, including their jury, are teenagers. So the defense attorneys, the prosecutors, the clerks, the bailiffs, and a jury of their peers are all teenagers. And the sentence, which is structured depending on what type of offense it is, maybe you'll get 10 hours of community service versus 30. Maybe you'll have to write a 500 letter of apology versus a 2,000 word letter of apology. It goes on and on. The sentencing dispositions are structured, but the kids who are on the jury after a full hearing get to decide what to do with that. The only adult in the entire process is the judge. And it's usually one of my prosecutors, by the way, doing their 2 hours of community service, which I give every person in my office 2 hours each week to go volunteer in the community. What we're trying to do is say to the kids, you can be the solution, not the problem. We need young leaders. We want this to mean something. We don't want just a 5-minute tough talk from me or Judge Corpening. We want this to be a teachable moment for you. We've been doing teen court for over 15 years now, and it greatly reduces recidivism. It's working. And it's keeping their records clean, which again, even before we started with Raise the Juvenile Age initiatives, this district has long tried to give deferred prosecutions and have other ways of making sure that we are being swift, maybe not being as severe as we technically could be if it means getting rid of the collateral consequences of a permanent record. And of course, we're still with violent criminals. We are still, regardless of their age, we're still saving our resources for those moments and doing everything we can to hold people fully accountable. So those are a few of the things that we've done in the way of initiatives. Just very quickly before I open it up to questions, I want to just say a couple more things about criminal justice reform. I mentioned the mass incarceration and saying, well, what's our role in that in the court system? Well, can't we agree, and this is not just about our kids now, but it certainly includes a whole lot of them, that we don't want mentally ill people in our prison system. We certainly don't want people who have an inability to pay to only be languishing in jail because they can't afford a bond, like someone who's homeless or living in a high poverty situation. And people who have drug addictions need treatment. They don't need a cage. And so what we did, and this was 8 years ago when I was the president of the Conference of District Attorneys, the legislators came to our conference and said, prison's getting too expensive and it's not as effective for those categories of folks you just mentioned, Ben. Can we do something different in our state? And what we called it was justice reinvestment. And what we said is, why don't we stop putting everyone in prison who we could, and instead put them into drug and mental health treatment? Why don't we start working with people like Meb and Boyd to say, with our young kids, we can actually focus on their childhood trauma, which is the true gateway drug. It's not marijuana, it's childhood trauma. And if we know from Amy Fife at Carousel Center that this little girl's been sexually assaulted, we need to focus on her PTSD right now at age 8, because she's going to be that young woman who's dropped out of high school and has a heroin addiction 10 years from now if we do nothing. And if we can save that money in incarceration and put it back into the community, into all these wonderful things that I know so many of you are passionate about, we actually can keep our community safer by keeping it healthier. And so how are we doing on that? Well, that was 8 years ago. Justice Reinvestment was an initiative in 2012 where we said, we're going to rewrite the habitual felon laws and say for your third strike, it can't be someone stealing a loaf of bread. Let's talk about violent criminals, please. For drug possession cases, mandatory probation, not prison cells. And for the mentally ill, let's really focus on, again, treatment. Unless it's violent, we don't want that in a jail cell either. And let's raise the age. So that was a big part of this initiative too. Most of you would probably think that if North Carolina 8 years ago had 40,000 prisoners spread out throughout the 60 prisons in our state, you'd say, well, how many is it almost a decade later, Ben? Is it more like 50,000? I mean, you know, we continue to go up if you look at America, right? Actually, in the last 8 years, we've closed 11 prisons. We've reduced the prison population from 40,000 to 36,000. That's 10%. And in the process, we have saved $500 million because every prisoner, and there's recurring costs, but it's over $30,000 a year to incarcerate someone, to say nothing of what they could be doing on the outside to be contributing members. And so saving $500 million through the Department of Adult Corrections by closing these prisons has allowed us to reinvest that money, and that's why it's called Justice Reinvestment, into all the things we really need to be doing, which first and foremost to me needs to be our kids. It needs to be victim services. It needs to be the reentry programs that we could talk about. And first and foremost, I think we need to focus on public education, because when we do that, and that's a constitutional right, by the way, North Carolina is one of the few states where it's a constitutionally protected right to have affordable public education in North Carolina. We're trying to do our part within the justice system to really say, you know, if everything's a priority, then nothing is a priority. Our priority are violent and career criminals. Our priority are our children. And there are things that we can do by working with other stakeholders in the community to really lower the crime rate. Here's where we are in 2020 as a final thing. It has never been safer for everyone listening right now than October of 2020. This is the lowest crime rate in the recorded history of the port city. And that's not accidental. It's a very strategic way we've been going about saying we are going to incarcerate the worst of the worst, but there are so many things we can do to make this a better place to live. And when you focus on those things, not calling kids at risk, you're just calling them kids. They're not problem kids, they're kids with problems. Instead of labeling kids, we start labeling their problems and addressing those things. You start growing up in a different environment. And when you think about the wonderful energy that's coming into this community from all over, with great entrepreneurs and women leaders like Judy Gerard, who I just mentioned, saying we can do even better, I'm excited for the future. I'm excited that my kids are growing up in a town like this, and I hope you are too. That's at least what we're trying to do when we focus so much on the school initiatives. I'll end by saying that a neighbor of mine killed his best friend in an impaired driving wreck the first month I was sworn in as district attorney. And that was a tragic case for me to have to go meet the family of the kid who was never coming home. And I have seen far too many of those cases in my time as district attorney. And one thing I committed to that family back then, which I've tried to keep that promise every year, is to say, why don't we just have an adult conversation with our kids? Why don't we go and start talking to them where they should be, which is in school, not have a talk with them after they've been given a right to remain silent, like when they get arrested. And so the best part of my job, if you were wondering, as it relates to our school children, is every year I visit every middle school and high school in New Hanover and Pender County and speak to the 8th grade students and the seniors at those schools every year. And for good measure, I also talk to about 3,000 incoming freshmen every year at UNCW, spread out over 6 nights at their orientation. And what I've learned from them is way more than I could ever teach them. But I can tell you that they are hungry for adults to be in charge. And they want to have a conversation about choices and consequences. I have had the benefit of bringing so many of them, about 10 every semester, into my office as interns. As was alluded to by Beth, I'm a teacher now. I've got a class of 75 kids tonight at UNCW, and I see what's out there right now, and I'm very hopeful about the future when I see them. But getting the chance to go to all those schools and talking about things that frankly change. I mean, kids didn't even have cell phones 16 years ago, and now every 8th grader does when I'm asking them to raise their hands. Sexting was something that no one knew even the term for, and now you're worried about that for your granddaughter and grandson. Vaping, I mean, whoever even heard of those things? And now we're seeing e-cigarettes all over the place. So things will change, but doing the right thing never does. And the importance of adults staying in charge and giving the kids structure instead of kids giving each other structure is still, to me, what it's always been about. So with that, I'm just going to stop for a minute. I know I've been talking for a little over a half hour, and ask if there's any questions.
Yep, we have some questions, and thank you, Mr. David, very much. So I'd like to build on this one a little bit. You've talked about education in general. A lot of it has been directed at more middle and high school. So Barbara asked our question. She says, I applaud the initiative of Judge Corpening through the school justice program. My question is, why wait until middle school when many children are already being groomed by gangs? What is being done for elementary age children through your programs? And we know about the importance of early childhood education, even preschool, in terms of being able to prevent later involvement with the criminal justice system. So are you advocating for increased funding, access to early childhood? What are you doing for elementary schools?
Yes, absolutely. Well, first, wonderful question. Let me try and hit that head on. The only reason that I don't go to all the elementaries also is, frankly, there's not enough hours in my day. I talk to plenty of elementary kids too, but to build the crowd and to get them all together, I mean, you're talking about over 30 elementary schools, and there's only 8 middle schools. So I kind of wait to then only out of practical necessity. I'm with communities and schools on Thursday filming a video about safe social media that's going to go out to 25,000 of them. So we're still getting to kids, just in different ways. Let me say, though, that as it relates to the issue specifically of gangs, you're right. They're getting to kids way younger than middle school even now. We have a wonderful program through the New Hanover Sheriff's Office called the GREAT program. And the GREAT is gang resistance education training. And it basically takes some rising 5th graders and shows them that, you know, officers are the good guys. We have a whole week devoted to them, you know, playing with the dogs that are there, just like our therapy dog here, to see the helicopters and you know, the wonderful resources that the sheriff's office has. We take them on field trips, in other words. So we are doing things as early as 5th grade and have for a long time. And these are identified usually by teachers and guidance counselors, or kids who really need kind of that mentoring from adults who are in the system to say, hey, we want to help you. You need to report crime when it happens to you. Don't take it into your own hands, because that's a lot of what we see in Wilmington. So we work with 5th graders on specifically on gang resistance. But yeah, we need to do a whole lot more. And, you know, obviously parents, there's no replacing parents in this equation, and grandparents. And there's many grandparents now in our community raising their kids. In fact, where I go to church with my family, First Presbyterian Church, our signature mission is the Grandparent Support Network. And that's supporting grandmothers. I mean, to be blunt about it, it's grandmothers raising their kids because the kids are nowhere to be found. And they need our support because it's pretty exhausting when you're 75 having 4 kids under the age of 15 under roof with you. At least that's what I've been told. I can tell you it's exhausting at age 50.
Right, right. Okay, we have another question here. It relates to parole officers. Someone said they'd love to see our parole officers help register eligible former offenders to vote. It should be part of the process as they exit the system.
Agreed. And in fact, I applaud Mayor Michael Bloomberg. I know in my former state of Florida, he's trying to get thousands and thousands of former felons to get registered to vote. People ask me, are they eligible? And the answer is, it depends. You are not eligible as long as you're under active confinement or you're within the probation system. But once you are no longer in that, you are eligible to vote, but you have to get your citizenship rights restored. And I think we can do much better as a community to be very active in trying to get ex-offenders, people who have gone through the system and have paid their debt to society, fully engaged with that process again. And so, yes, I actually would encourage you to get Melinda Pittman, who is at the probation office, onto a call with you and ask her if there's anything they could do while they're on probation to get them like focused on coming all the way back. One initiative that I started, for instance, because I have 2 prisons in my district and also 2 very large jails, is we started something locally that's now a state law called Operation Clean Slate. And that's when someone is in prison or in jail, before they get released, we do a record check and make sure that there's nothing pending in other jurisdictions. They used to just be getting released when their order for arrest in Asheville for, let's just say, a DWI from 10 years ago was still hanging out there. So they get released, they still couldn't get their driver's license, and then they run from police when they're on the roads. What we do now is, before they're even eligible to get released on their armed robbery charge, for instance, is we run their record and say, oh, wait, they've still got something that was called and failed years ago in that jurisdiction. We call the DA there now and say, do you want to run that time concurrently or dismiss it or let them plead guilty and add some onto that sentence? But we're not going to release them when we have a captive audience to kind of take care of everything. I believe we can do the same thing that we do with Operation Clean Slate, because what we try to do is get license restored. We're trying to get driver's license restoration going. We can do the same thing with voting that we're doing with driver's license restoration. So yes, I'm all for that. That's a wonderful question.
All right. We have an offer for you. It says, Ben, we'd love to help mentor and engage those students at UNCW. Please announce to them that the League of Women Voters is a great way to be civically involved. Membership is free for students. Could you let them know?
Excellent. And then I have a couple of questions then for you. Is that only for my female students, or are young men allowed with the League of Women Voters also to be mentored?
Men can join the League of Women Voters. We have male members.
That's good to hear.
Yeah. And then
I will pass that on. I will pass that on. And speaking of classes, by the way, I just want to say, for the last 5 years, in addition to teaching at UNCW for the undergraduate students, Beth and some of the others listening now have been a part of the OLLI program, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. I currently have 55 OLLI students taking the class, just like the 75 undergraduates. I would love for anybody listening to be a part of that class in the spring. We are going to take it again in the spring. I'm going to offer it again. And because of COVID, it's online. How it works, there's a book that I've written called Crime and Community in the Cape Fear that's actually coming out nationally on November 2nd. This is the final course packet before it comes out as a first edition book. And there's 8 chapters to this book, and it covers everything from violence in the home to the opioid epidemic, from police shootings and racial justice, which everyone's talking about now, to the gang violence we just mentioned. It's called Crime and Community because half of it is dealing with the terrible things I see with my day job, and the other half is how we can prevent it. So what we've done for the OLLI students and for the undergraduates, because we can't be in person with each other right now, and most people go to sleep during Zoom calls, is instead of just me Zooming with my students, about 3 months ago, I hired a film crew to follow me around this district, into police stations, into jails and prisons, into courthouses where I've given some of these closing arguments, to interview people like Bertha Todd, who was part of the Martin Luther King 50 celebration, or Chip Mahan, who started Hometown Hires with me, or Donnie Williams, who's talking about growing up in Creekwood and now being chief of police. If we're going to have a shoot, don't shoot scenario, let's go onto a shooting range with some SWAT team members and talk about what goes into those decisions. So these 8 videos that we've created are a companion to this 8-chapter book. They're each an hour and a half in length. So as an OLLI student, what you would do is you would get this book, and then you would watch it self-paced, an hour and a half videos, kind of like you're watching Netflix. And then at the end of the 4th chapter, I come in and we do this for 2 hours to do a Q&A about what you just read and heard for the first half of the book. And then we do the same thing for the second half of the book with the second 4 lectures and chapters. I would love to have some of you who are listening now to be part of that OLLI class. It'll be in the spring catalog, and we're going to be starting it up again in January. So please be on the lookout for that.
And I see you've got about 5 minutes. Some of our questions are relating to prevention.
Yes.
One of the questions that we had was in terms of ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences. What do you recommend that schools and community can do to support students with high ACE scores, especially now during the pandemic, because we know ACEs are rising? And then Mevan put in a question, which is kind of not quite related to that, but she said, how are the young adults getting their hands on weapons? Is there anybody stopping the flow of guns into the hands of youth? So how do we help with some of this prevention?
Sure, I'll answer that second question first. A lot of weapons are on the street because people leave them in cars, and 90% of all breaking and enterings into cars are into unlocked cars. So I would tell any gun owner, and we know the Second Amendment gives people the right to bear arms, please lock up your guns because they're falling into kids' hands because of breaking and entering into cars. The other way that we're seeing a lot is granddad, grandmom has, the gun, and the grandkid is addicted to pills and then gets addicted to heroin. 8 out of 10 heroin users started with pills, and 75% of them started with someone else's pills. And so that's why we've been having, pill drops and everything else. But when someone is addicted to pills and they look a whole lot like your kids and grandkids, a lot of times when they go in to buy drugs and they start running out of money, they start trading grandma and granddad's weapons instead of money for those guns. So that very frequently we're seeing guns on the street come out through the drug trade, where users are giving them to dealers who are convicted felons and can't go in and buy them. As for the ACE scores, let me just quickly say something on that. I gave a TED talk this time last year when they had 5 of us come in to Thalian Hall and film a 15-minute segment on what can we do to build a bridge to a better future. I want you to write down this website. It's benjaminrdavid.com. benjaminrdavid.com is the website that I've created for this OLLI class that I just mentioned. There's some things on there like the catalog for online classes that you need to go through OLLI to actually get the password to get. But the TED Talk is right on there. It's the first thing you see when you click on there. And there's no password required. Just watch that TED Talk. I've laid out over 17 and a half minutes why everyone needs to be involved with the science of hope called resiliency, why we really need to be focusing on ACE scores. I believe there's nothing more that we can do right now to make this a better community in 20 years from now than to absolutely be laser-like focused on ACE scores. and to support the work that Mebane is doing. So please watch that video and share it widely with your friends. I'm trying to get that word out. I still talk to a number of trauma-informed people at New Hanover Regional Medical Center who have no idea what I'm talking about when I say ACE scores. And first responders and clearly people who are in medicine, all of us need to be speaking that language right now.
Okay.
I see a couple of these other questions. I'll try and quickly answer them.
Okay.
9th grade week-long program, English class covered all sorts of issues like dating, domestic abuse, sexting. Combination of videos, discussions, writing was initiated by the Liz Claiborne Foundation. Is there such a program here? Marlene, I'm not aware of it. If there is, please make it famous because I don't know about it, and we need to get the word out if there is a resource like that. If someone has an in with Liz Claiborne, by all means, encourage them to call me. I'd love to give a letter of support for an initiative like that. When are we going to get a male version of Glow? That's a great question. I actually just flew to Chattanooga, Tennessee with Chip Mahan and Judy Gerard last month. That's what happens when you got a private jet, you can fly friends like that. And we went to an all-male school that was about 5 years behind their all-female charter school that they did in Chattanooga. And we would like to bring that model here. And there's some good people right now who are actively trying to pursue that. I think that will happen in the next 3 years. I wish it happened 3 days ago, but I think that's coming. Boy, I wish I had 2 hours for this. And I so apologize that I'm on live TV and about 15 minutes from now, five minutes away. So I unfortunately have to hang up with you. I know I talked a lot. I hope I didn't bore you. I really appreciate the work that many of you have been doing for years in our community. It hasn't gone unnoticed by your district attorney. Let me end by saying that during this pandemic, because we've had a backlog in the system, we haven't had jury trials since mid-March, and we're starting with those next week. 98% of all justice is not jury trials. It's pleas, it's probation violations, it's bond hearings. So all that's been continuing. But just getting back to my OLLI students, I just hired 3 of them to be temporary workers between now and Christmas to attack this backlog. And I really rely on many of you who are plugged into this community, who help us get the word out about wonderful initiatives and do the hard work of building community to help prevent crime. Let me know from time to time how we're doing. Invite me back, or if there's some particular thing within our office you'd like to hear about, we probably have a career prosecutor that's dedicated the last 15 to 20 years to that. So please feel free to include any of them if you would like to know more about anything from human trafficking to drug addiction to domestic violence to whatever the issue is that is a concern to the League of Women Voters.
We thank you very, very much for your time. Good luck with your not so nice next intervention, I guess. And again, thank you very, very much. We will be recording the session, and we can send you the chat if you want to look at that at all.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank
Take
you
care, ladies. I really appreciate the invite today.